Now we're live. Hey, everybody, welcome to Iconic. I'm here as always on Tuesday talking with Richard of Amboria. We are like $16 away from 200% funding on this, and we have 25 days to go. Thank you all for your generosity. This has been just kind of an amazing ride so far. We have a ton of great things still to unlock. We've got another mini coming. We've got a series of, can I spoil the adventures a little bit? Like they're
Yeah,
time
sure.
travel-y
Yeah,
adventures?
yeah.
Because time travel is a thing that can happen to you in Emboria.
It is. It is. And basically, these are kind of like almost like insert anywhere adventures that you could just run them straight and so basically they'll have rules which I will finish devising after I finish some other things, but they'll have rules basically like here's how you make characters set in like the prehistory of
Yeah,
the world under Starlight. So obviously things are at a much more epic scale,
yeah.
right?
Well, and I think,
Like sort of yeah, so you can make characters with mythic past, or so you could just run it straight like that. You could be like, hey, let's go run something to have to our ancestors. But also, there are certain places, especially the Serpentama, the Withered Wood in the which will be in Thunder North. There are certain places where you can enter into like what's called a snarl in time, and just find yourself like it's a place where there's like let's say lots of eddies, right?
mm-hmm.
The river does not flow totally laterally, and you can find yourself caught up in one of those eddies and kind of cast back to the time of your ancestors. You can create fun grandfather paradoxes for yourself, etc. So basically, these adventures are really intended to be plugged in a way like that.
So very, oh man, what is the DS9 episode?
Oh, which one?
The
There's
Tribble episode.
design
The Tribble episode.
the trials and tribulations.
Trials and Tribulations. No
Yeah.
one's ever
So
known
you're
who my grandfather was. He just appeared.
yeah. Maybe I have to go on a date with this woman just to, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actually, as you know, I'm actually on the deep space nine watch
That's why I
right
brought it
now,
up.
almost done with season six. It's been so good. But the yeah there's like I think a disproportionate. It's probably not really true because there's always time travel in Star Trek. But there's like a lot of
There's a
time
lot.
travel in
I
TSN.
think especially because this is why you come to these streams because we're just gonna
They
you don't
also
know
do more mirror universe
yeah,
episodes than anybody
they do
else.
more mirror universe episodes, and I think the non-linear nature of the prophets
Profit. Yeah.
sort of just made it a
Yeah.
show that was rife with the possibility of time travel.
I think you're right, and I mean to that point, I've always been a sucker for non-linear things and even non-linear storytelling. One of
Mm-hmm.
my favorite films is Dunkirk. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, one of the great things about that movie, I mean, obviously, a lot of Nolan's stuff kind of plays around with time and
Mm-hmm.
non-linear storytelling and stuff like that. But I love Dunkirk because it's not a genre piece at all, unlike let's say Inception or something. But it tells the story in this whole non-linear way that kind of like and they use certain cues to let you know, oh, this is happening at the same time as that thing
Mm-hmm.
earlier. And then when you get to the end, it all kind of collects into a single thing.
Yeah.
That style of storytelling has strongly influenced how I write and run adventures. And so
Yeah.
hopefully that will be communicated. I will say it's making putting Thunder and the North together just awful. Like it's gonna be worth it. But trying to like take my crazy like Charlie from Always Sunny,
Kind of conspiracy board.
line conspiracy board, like to take that and then try to just like type it out in a linear fashion, be like, here, go in a campaign. This has proved actually quite challenging, but it's going to be great. But it has been,
And no
yeah,
pressure, just about 40 days till we'll be delivering it to backers.
yeah, it'll be done.
Yeah.
It'll be done.
In draft format, everybody. Let's not
This
get.
hair, yeah,
Yeah.
this hair may be a lot grayer, but it'll be done. It'll be
Yeah.
done. I spent a whole bunch of time yesterday uh, several hours yesterday actually writing. So this is your segue. So you ready
There
for
we
it?
go. Yeah, let's go for it.
Into the thing we're actually supposed to talk about. I spent a bunch of time yesterday writing the scholarly introduction on the provenance and dating of the poems from the first book of Odes, which doesn't sound like it's campaign related, and yet without doing this, I can't actually write the campaign. So it's
Yeah.
like all this stuff kind of like builds on itself. So yeah, so that was yesterday's writing.
Well, and that is a great segue. Like we have had many discussions about poetry and world building and your approach to it, which heavily influenced a lot of the final product of Jackals, because I ended up writing a lot more poetry than I had anticipated for it. And so let's talk about that, because you've always said Amboria is a world built on poetry. Like the world building is being done by poetries and by poets,
Yes.
because the best way to record these things, cultures around the world, is
Right.
poems.
Yeah. So you could say that to start it out, I mean, it's really interesting that you express it in that way, right? To say the best way to record these things, right? Not the best thing that was available at the time,
Yeah.
right? There is a like if you took a let's say you took a camcorder back to the Trojan War, right? And you wanted to capture that, you'd be like, oh, there's kind of a tiny city. Like we know like more or less historically where Troy was,
Yeah.
and we're like it's a there've been multiple cities built on
Mm-hmm.
that one site, which is case because for most like a good place to build a city is a good place to build a city.
Right.
So and so there's but they're pretty sure now that they've found the Troy,
Mm-hmm.
that is the Troy of the time of the Trojan War, right? So if you kind of dug back to that period, like if you could go back to the period with a video camera, you'd see like a relatively small city by modern standards, and you'd see a bunch of guys in hot armor out in the field, grunting and sweating, and like the video camera wouldn't pick up the goddess Athena wrapping Diomedes in the glory cloud as he goes on his
Or
rampage.
rumors striding across the
Right,
battlefield. Yeah.
right. Rumors, yeah, in striking fear
Yeah.
into the hearts of the Greek lions and things like that. Like none of that stuff would. I mean, it would have like there would just be one. There would be one level capture, right? Which would just be like the photo. What we call the photographic level, and the photographic level is of storytelling isn't even like the funny thing is it's not as objective as we like to think that it is. Like anybody who knows anything about filmmaking
Mm-hmm.
or journalism and things like that knows that the picture, like the things you choose to take a picture of and the way you do it still tells the story.
Yeah.
That's not totally objective. In fact, you can have something that happens in the news and half the country sees it one way and half the country sees it the other way. Everyone's looking at the same news clip, right? So that's the surface level, right? And modern ways of capturing that are primarily, let's say, information based,
Yeah.
are just not good at capturing anything beyond that surface level. So if you believe that there's something beyond that surface level, or you just want to create a world in which there's something beyond that surface level, right? Well, you can do one of two things. One is you could try to reduce everything to that surface level. So let's say you've got a magical setting, but magic is basically science, right? There are magical systems. Everything is super visible. You can see all the magic happening, and it's like your VTT with all of your like special effects packs
Mm-hmm.
loaded and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, that person's doing magic, so now we have some sparkly stuff with Securus lights here. Because how else would you know, right? That's one approach that basically says that photographic level is all there is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to go any deeper, especially if you want to go into the symbolism or you want to go really deep down into the roots of something, especially like why a nation exists, and get really deep down into things like chaos and the natural cycle and why the world is the way that it is, and like all the sort of ordinary quotidian things which are actually the most full of meaning, a tree and iron, bread and stone and wine and water and hills. And if you want to really get into what's actually special about all of these things, that's where poetry comes
Well,
in. And so this, yeah,
Tolkien really stresses that in the
yeah.
Mythopoeia poem that
Yeah,
he
and
wrote.
Mythopoeia and
Yeah.
Arthurian stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is kind of Tolkien's whole argument. And
Yeah.
so, in the ancient world, when people wanted to, let's say, encode these things,
Mm-hmm.
they did it primarily. primarily via poetry, and even like more than that, they did it in poetry that was like pretty participatory. Like the Iliad wasn't like just a book that sat on your shelf. Like if you
Right.
wanted to, you didn't read the Iliad. If you wanted to like hear it performed, you'd go somewhere. You'd hear people doing it. People, sitting around the campfire, or in the market square, like in the forum, and places like that. So it was this really participatory kind of thing, and that was how culture is actually, you could say, encoded and then
Hmm.
communicated, if you want to use information theory terms.
I like the way you use encoded. I'm reading through On the Shoulders of Giants, which is a collection of Umberto Eco's essays.
Yeah.
And he did an essay on the invisible. And what his argument was is that in some ways, poetry and stories are more real than history. And his argument was essentially, right, we hit the Enlightenment and suddenly we have a new definition of history, which is just the facts, man, to quote Dragnet.
Yes. Yes.
But he's like, you could find out, something could be revealed where Hitler didn't die in a bunker and instead fled to Argentina. And if we found actual evidence, we would all have to rewrite our objective view of history. Yet if you tell somebody Anna Karenina does not jump in front of the train, they will call you a liar
Right.
and and castigate you because
Right.
somehow Anna Karenina's story is more real than just this surface level objective facts that we have.
Yep. Yep. No, that's yeah. Yeah. And so if you want to encode this stuff and you want to pass it on to other people, historically the most, let's say, efficient means of doing that, or efficient, let's say the most durable.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, the most durable means of doing that has been through poetry, and specifically through um, narrative poetry. Although there are other kinds of poetry like panegyric and like pastoral poetry, which is actually also really, really important and very underrepresented in genre fiction. Not a lot of people out there writing pastoral poetry set in another universe. One of these days, I'll get to it. But anyway, so uh, this is how I start with Worldbuilding, right? Is that I started out with uh, usually the story, which is an image, or it's a kind of a myth that I want to tell. Or a lot of times I start with a real world exemplar, and but I wanted to kind of do my own retelling. Right? So I'll start with something like this, and I'll write a poem, and I'll try to write a narrative poem, and it'll be usually fairly long. So going for long form narrative poetry doesn't mean everything needs to be the length of the Iliad. But I mean, like if you think about it, the Iliad is, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of lines now. At some point, I looked this up. So you're repping for the Odyssey today, but yeah, that's it. I'll allow it.
I do.
I was always
I
more.
prefer the Iliad and the Aeneid, but I have this
I've always
shirt.
been more of an Iliad guy because of
Yeah.
the sheer number of
Mm-hmm.
people who get it.
Yeah.
But lots of good fights in the Iliad, but obviously the Odyssey is fantastic.
Yeah.
So, but I'll start out by writing out a long form poem. Like if you think about, yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey are super long, but a lot of long form narrative poetry is still significantly shorter. The Beowulf poem, for instance, is
Right.
about 2,400 lines or something like that, and 3,000 lines. Anyways, pretty short compared to like it's like the length of like one book of Iliad.
Yeah.
But the Beowulf poet basically hits everything,
Mm-hmm.
right?
He hits everything in that.
To tell a good story and actually manages to get like most of like Genesis and paganism and everything else in there too. So
The history of the Frisians. Is it the
yes,
Frisians? Yeah.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
very awesome.
Yeah.
You also have, but there are lots of other examples. Uh, there's actually quite a number of long form historical poems about like famous people. Uh, uh, the ascent of the dream of Scipio, for
Mm-hmm.
example, by Cicero. Lots of really famous long form narrative poetry written about the life or to kind of eulogize famous people who were really important in certain ways. So there are a lot of historical exemplars you could work from, and but I usually try to write something that's at least a few hundred lines long, maybe longer, and then and this this is a process that takes months.
Yeah.
Well, once that's done, then I like to usually sit on it for a little while. So once I've sat on it for a while, I'll go back and like write an introduction and sort of try to think of it now as a different person, not as the person who composed the text, but rather the person who a person who's coming along later and trying to situate where the text belongs in a wider liturgical, poetic, literary narrative tradition. And so I'll come back and do that. And then later on, just really as the fancy strikes me over the course of usually several years, I'll rewrite the story. But I will also do a lot of things that aren't quite rewrites, but that maybe introduce like a small element to the tradition. So I might do a story as a narrative poem, and then I come back later and I'm going to write some liturgical hymns,
Mm-hmm.
right? So hymns to be used as part of like a ritual. And I'll write those hymns about the thing that I wrote the story about, but as I'm writing those hymns, I get new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
New images come to me, and so new little details get inserted into the story. Well, instead of going back then and rewriting the story, which you could do, but then you're down to you only have one layer.
Mm-hmm.
What we really want to go for world building wise is multiple layers. And so then I'll go back later and I'll write the same story, but I'll write it in a different verse form. Say maybe it's a later text or it's an earlier text for that matter. And then I'll incorporate the new details that I've already worked out, as well as new details that come to me in the course of writing. And over the course of this, what you get are essentially stories that still have the same essential core, but they also grow in the retelling.
Yeah.
And so when you've done this 3 or 4 times, which again, this is not an efficient process. If you just like stand up a tabletop set into market or something.
Yeah.
And there are ways to fake this stuff out. Right? You could certainly just write one version of the story, come up with some extra details, and then write your little faux critical
Analysis.
textual. Oh, there are these other versions, but I'm only putting this one up, etc.
Broken references.
Yeah, you make broken reference, and everybody does these. Tolkien did them, although not very many. He only has like 2 in Lord of the Rings, and everything else is like a real reference. And obviously, Dune famously like did this all the time, where they would just like the different chapter headers in Dune would just give like a little excerpt from one of the books written by Princess Irulan, right?
Yep.
For the World Under Starlight, there are no broken references.
Yeah.
If I reference another book in anything, if I reference a historical event in anything, it is referencing something that exists somewhere else. It might just be in my hard drive at this point, or just in my notebook at this point, but it is existing. It is referencing something that exists in its entirety somewhere else.
Yeah.
And to me, this is really what makes the World Under Starlight unique as tabletop settings go, is how deep it goes, but also that because of the interplay between these different texts, there are a lot of intentional gaps that I've left. And those gaps are for you to, as the players and GMs, for you to play into and to figure out how and what, like, well, how did this happen? And why is there this discrepancy and things like this? So just because your world building is deep and just because it's thorough doesn't mean that you have to also write all of the mystery out of the setting. And I think that Tolkien didn't do that, but what he did was so convincing world building wise that a lot of people thought that he did.
Yeah.
And so it's actually led to this kind of a weird complaint that I've heard sometimes about people who are like, "Oh, I don't like Tolkien because just everything is explained." And you're like, "Well, no, not everything is explained, but maybe you went to Wikipedia or something else, and you read everybody's theories, and now but actually Tolkien himself, he doesn't explain everything, and there's actually a bunch of weird, unexplained stuff.
There's so much stuff he doesn't know. Like, he doesn't know what happened to the Entwives, or who Tom Bombadil truly is, or what Tom Bombadil truly is.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, I do leave room for mystery in this approach, right? But hopefully, actually, the mysteries feel like real mysteries because things look on the surface, they look very like oh well, obviously this is the way things are. But then if you dig down just a little bit under the surface layers, just like in the real world, anything. Once you dig down beneath those surface layers, you're going to find stuff that is significantly more complex than you thought it was.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, when we say like this is poetic world building. That's what made it kosher first. It's multi-layered, and it has this sort of sense of time baked into things. Not by actually, I think it's a huge mistake, and a lot of fantasy authors do this to just try to create a sense of time by saying this happened so many thousands of years ago. And actually, again, to use Tolkien as an example, his timeline is so much shorter by
Hmm.
comparison to almost anything, new time or whatever. Um, it's like 7,000 years or something from 3,000 years from the fall of Sauron to Frodo, right? And
Hmm.
you know, anyway, the point is, it's like not that many thousands of years compared to basically everything else out in the fantasy world. And yeah, Tolkien has a much more convincing sense of depth and time
Hmm.
than almost anybody else in the genre. So trying to do something similar here, where there's a sense of time baked into things, but it's not, it's a few millennia since the forging of the Worldbuilding came, which hopefully if you're a Kickstarter backer, you should have that story then, right?
Yeah, the
That
Elder Lay of
story is
Sanctum.
like, yeah, that story is like the eighth version of that story. I've
Yeah.
been rewriting that story since day one. It's literally the first story in Legendary. So there's layers to that particular poem that won't be immediately apparent, but if you get access to, eventually some of the others will come out, and you read those, and you'll start to see, oh, wait a minute, there's some layers to this. And there's some differences here in the Elder Lay that aren't in some of the later versions,
Yeah.
which are actually composed first, in real life. But
Yeah.
um, anyway, so all that to say, hopefully the sense of time comes from the layering and the kind of, let's say, complexity. And part of that complexity is a certain amount of ambiguity and mystery. And I would say to anybody who's interested in running Amboria, like, don't be intimidated by
No.
the idea that, oh well, I'll never be able to do this just like Richard or whatever, right? Because that's not the goal, right? This is in a way, it's sort of like my love letters to the world, but now I'm putting it out there. And you're going to tell your own stories. They're going to be different from my stories.
Hmm.
That's going to be okay. But I really can't wait to see what people do with it once it gets out. So.
Yeah. Awesome. I just in hearing you talk about all that, I'm taking Zane through Doctor Who and my wife through Doctor Who. I never really watched it. There's that
Yeah.
one of my favorite lines from the Matt Smith run is souls are made of stories, not of atoms.
Oh,
And I
nice.
think that's one of the things that I love about role-playing games and that I love
Yeah.
about Emboria is that it feeds this idea and need that we have for beauty in our life and stories. So, all right, well, we'll be back next week with something else to talk about. But thanks to everybody who's backing. We'll put this live. Go check out the Emboria Kickstarter. It is close to 200% funded.
Your $16 could be the $16
That pushes us
that
over.
push us over that hump. So,
Yeah.
get out there and check it out.
Awesome. Well, Richard, I look forward to chatting with you more about this. And next time, maybe we'll be talking about the actual play. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I'll see you all later. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.